Hello, my name is Darryl Robert Schoon, and today I'm going to talk about one of my favorite subjects, politics. Now, we all know that in polite company, two issues should not be brought up, politics and religion. Well, I'm not in polite company. I'm alone in a studio with some people watching. So I have the time to myself, and I'm going to talk about politics. But I'm going to talk about it in such a way that I want to shed light on what appears to be a transparent process, but in fact it is not. And it's designed to appear to be transparent just as much as it is designed not to be. All right? I majored in political science in college. And most of you probably have found my YouTubes and writings because of what I've talked about economics. And that came late in the game. 1990s, I began focusing on the Great Depression and just trying to see what was going on. And my focus became so intense that when the dot-com bubble collapsed in the year 2000, I was already probably quite sure what was going to happen. In fact, it did. It hasn't unfolded exactly like it, but it unfolded enough for me to give me a context within which the change was going to happen. And therefore, that's when my reputation got made. And I was, as I wrote articles and published, and I've talked in Australia, and I've talked in Europe, and a couple of places in the United States, and been interviewed on issues of the economic crisis. But my first love, I can't call it a love now, my first attraction was to political science, which is the study of change. And what I want to do is present to you what's going on in the United States in a way that makes it understandable to everyone, whether you vote or not, whether you're a Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative, mixture of the two, or disaffected or alienated or angry or whatever. I want to frame what's going on today in the United States in the spring of 2015 in a way that makes sense, perhaps in a way that you haven't looked at it before. And I want to, it's sort of like seeing through a telescope. And you're looking through it, and it doesn't make sense. You see what's going on, but it doesn't make sense. That's because you're looking through it at the wrong end. You're probably looking at the end of those who go to voting booths and pull that thing, lever, push those holes, and vote for your person to get what you want to happen. Well, a study was just shown that what happens when you pull that lever or punch those things, or the chads or whatever they're called, that is far less correlatable with public policy than with the elites at the top. When they want something, it happens. All right? When you want something, probably doesn't happen, all right? But you're just as engaged. You're just as engaged. I mean, the people who support Kentucky, the fans who are now going to the Final Four and really are into Kentucky, are no less rabid than the people who lost out and their team was in the NIT, didn't even make it to the NCAA, okay? Because your identification with the issues or with the team is just as strong as your identification with political issues. What I want to tell you is that the folks who are setting up the political game, it's very different than the ones who set up the NCAA tournament. Because so much more is at stake with politics. And what is at stake is money and power. And I want to tell you, those who are watching this, who probably have much less money and much less power, though your attachment to the system is just as strong as those who have huge amounts of money and huge amounts of power, there's a reason. Because when money and power is at stake, they're not going to let it be determined by people who are not themselves. The democratic process, the two-party system, has devolved into a whitewash, into an apparently transparent process where you get to watch people coming together and then you place your bets. I want this person, I want that person, I want this person, I agree with this. And you'll get in fights at bars or with your husband and wives about what's going on. And the truth of the matter is, what is actually going to happen was pretty much predetermined far away from you. Now, I know there's a channel on the cable networks called C-SPAN where you get to watch the political process in action, and every once in a while they'll have a shot of the Senate chambers or the Congress House, and what it is. Some lone man standing there reading from a thing to an empty house. You know, no one's there. All right? Why? Because nothing gets done there. Okay? That's why no one's there. The other members of the Senate and the other members of the Congress are out there talking to lobbyists, raising money, trying to get it done. All right? And that money does not come free. I remember Gavin Newsom. I think Gavin has decided to run for the Senate in the state of California. I remember when he was running, he had been appointed to be on the Board of Supervisors by Willie Brown, consummate politician. And they asked Gavin, who was a young man, came from a family of wealth, okay? They asked Gavin, they said, well, are you going to run for re-election? And Gavin said, you know, I don't think so. And they said, why? He said, you know, if somebody gives me $5 and I'm running for office, I have a feeling that I owe them something. I thought, wow, that's pretty honest. Okay? Now, in retrospect, Gavin did run, and he took more than $5. But I think he took it with the knowledge that the $5 or the $5,000 or the $5 million came with strings. And the more money, the more strings. So I would hope, and I know that Gavin would take those with a lot more responsibility than the ones who are just trying to get for public office. All right? Whether you're on the right or the left, these are the dynamics. Money drives the process. Why? Because the process determines who gets the money and who gets the power. Now, for those listening to this program, you're on the other end. You're in the end, you're sitting there listening to it, you turn into Fox News or MSNBC or Daily Kos or Rush Limbaugh, depending on your preset prejudices. You got a horse in the race. You think it's you know it's not you, but you think that horse represents you. Now what that horse does, it says the things that you want to hear. It's a talking horse. All right? It's a talking horse. And that horse gets your attention because it gives voice to your hopes and your fears. And so you go in that booth on that day in, what is it, November, and pull that lever or punch that Chad and hope for the best. That's how you see it. And sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. And when the election's over, you sort of forget, and the process goes on. But I want to tell you, that's when the real deal gets done. That's when real politics get done. Because that's when the bills get written. All right? That's when the votes happen. But those votes happen and they're prearranged. They have all the money into politics comes through the central committees of the Democratic and Republican parties. They parcel out the money depending on who they want in there. Okay? And if you're not playing by the game, you don't get there. All right? But if you're playing in the game and you have shown a remarkable ability to get people to vote for you, they don't care who you are. That's the most important thing. The candidates are picked from the aggregate political elites at the top for one thing and one thing only: the ability to get votes into the system. Now, why are more and more people not voting? Why are more and more people disaffected from the two-party political system? There's a simple reason. Because after years of going in, pulling on that lever, punching that card, doing this, you're pretty well frustrated. You're pretty well alienated. Okay? Your person gets in there. They said what you wanted to say. You picked candidate A over B, C, D, and E. All right? And they got in there, and you went in there, and when they won, you felt great. You felt vindicated. You felt your world was going to come. And when your candidate lost, you felt horrible. All right? And so all of you have felt one of these two things. But what you've also felt over these years of going in there, pulling on that lever, you know, punching that Chad or marking that ballot, is a sense of frustration. That no matter what you did, no matter how well they talked, no matter how convinced you were, it didn't go the way you wanted it to go. I am going to explain why. Because you've been looking at it through the wrong end of the tube. I want to turn that tube around and give you a sense of what the other people see happening and who you are. You're necessary for them for one thing, to legitimize the political choices that they are going to make. You don't vote, those choices don't get legitimized. All right? They pick candidates to get you to come in, and some of those, and I'm not saying they're not sincere. They are sincere. Some of them are more callous than others. But if they didn't really sort of believe, if they didn't give voice to your hopes and fears, you would know it. All right? There's enough whores around, that's where it is. So what happens is, the candidates who do get in are the candidates who those at the top know generally are going to vote the way they want them to and put them in there and give them the money to. And they have that ability to convince you, the one who is going to legitimize their choices that have already been made, and legitimize the system with decisions that are already in place. There is a book that just came out right now in softback. I suggest you read it. And if you don't read that book, you find out about the lady who wrote that book. She formerly worked on Wall Street as an analyst. Her name is Nomi Prins, P-R-I-N-S. All right? This book got absolute star reviews from the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, all the good book reviews, all the serious things. It wasn't just an ideological polemic about how our system of two-party system has failed us. No. That's preaching to everybody. Right side, left side, disaffected center. Everybody knows it's dysfunctional. The name of the book was called All the President's Bankers. All right? I think for those who are watching this program, you already know that money talks, money walks, money buys votes. And if the politicians aren't for sale, they're certainly for lease. Okay? And that's why things happen the way they do. That's why during the last huge economic crisis, the government bailed out the boys in Wall Street who caused the crisis with your money, with your obligation. Trillions of dollars. Asked nothing from Wall Street in return. In fact, 2 years later, Wall Street returned the favor by paying themselves huge bonuses, much to the chagrin of you whose money was used to put them back in power. And nothing was done about it. Nothing. Neither from the Democrats nor from the Republicans. Why? Because they own both parties. Now, if this wasn't always so, and that's what I'm going to talk about in this program and explaining politics to you. Before the last 50 years, all right, money had influence in both parties. All right? But basically, the Republicans were always the grand old party. They were the party of the establishment. Money, Wall Street, New York. All right? Fiscal conservatives. Now, why were these people fiscal conservatives? Why? Because they made most of the money in America. All right? They owned the corporations. All right? They were politically, fiscally conservative. Now, what does that mean? That means when money was at stake, they didn't want things to change. They didn't want things to change. Now, why didn't they want things to change? Because they owned the system. They already had it in hand. If your father had given you a trust fund, all right, the chances of you being a Republican were enormous from self-interest alone. Okay? Self-interest alone. Because you were already entitled in that system. And you would want that system to stay, because if the system stayed the way it was, you would continue to be at the top of that system. All right? Now, the Democrats were they weren't the boys who controlled the corporations and the economic power and Wall Street of this country. They were resistant. All right? And before the 1960s, the core of the Democratic Party was in the South. The South. Now let me roll things back. Okay? Before the 1960s, in the traditional way, the power elites, their true home was in the Republican Party. All right? Now, how many can constitute the power elites? We now have a phrase in this country that we didn't have 10 years ago. It's called the 1%. All right? The 1%. The truth of the matter is, real wealth is held by the 1/10 of 1%. Real wealth in this country. The 1% truly own, I think, 80% of the assets in this country. All right? But the top 1% own a greater proportion, 1/10 of 1% own a greater proportion of that wealth than the 9/10 of 1%. The concentration is phenomenal. All right? And the Republican Party, they were the fiscal conservatives. They wanted to keep things the way they were. In fact, they wanted them to be more than the way they were. Who resisted these? What was the other party? Well, the other party was the Democrats. Now, let me assure you, the Democrats also had their backers. All right? They're moneyed backers. Okay? But their moneyed backers were not the same conglomerate that backed the elite Republicans. The elite, they were sort of breakaway. All right? But because the real money was always in the established Wall Street Party until 1992. But we're not there yet. We're in the 1950s, when the left and the right was basically a two-party system. On the right, this is my right, okay, was the GOP, Republicans, conservative. I don't think you ought to spend money for that. That's them, okay? On the left, the liberals. Okay? And they had this fight between them. Okay? Now, the Republicans had all the money, most of it. Okay? But the Democrats had a lot of the votes. Why? Because the South. Why? The South lost the Civil War. And they were mad, and they never forgot it. All right? They blamed, one of the reasons, the moneyed interests from New York for what happened to them. All right? And partly they were right. Only partly. All right? They didn't want to talk about slavery. Okay. But they had a boner, a severe boner for those rich Northern Yankee Republican money. All right? And they hated them. They hated them with a hatred that ran from generation to generation to generation. And the Dixiecrats were powerful. They sat on these committees for generations, and they locked them, and they had it. That's why they began voting in things that you couldn't stay there for so long. They had to roll you out. They had term limits and stuff like that. They were trying to break the hold of this conservative Southern voting bloc that held the Democratic power base together. That power, that two-party system looked that way until the 1960s. Well, what happened in the 1960s? Change. All right? Now, let me tell you about the two parties and change. All right? The Republicans, well, we don't want change. We like the way things are. I mean, we know things that are going to change, but we want them to shove them to the right in this direction. All right? This is how we want. Okay? This is what we want. Okay? The liberals, we want change. We want change, and we're going to shove it in this direction. Okay? That's how it happened until the 1950s. In the 1960s, change on a massive, unanticipated scale swept through the United States. Women's rights, civil rights, huge amounts of change, bra burnings, marches down south, swept across this country. All right? No one expected it. But it was huge, and the effects politically were extraordinary. What it did, it dislodged the Democratic power base. The core of the Democratic power base were the Southern Democrats, known at that time as Dixiecrats. All right? They hated Northern money. But what happened is, these are the people today calling themselves social conservatives. All right? Fiscal conservatives didn't want anything to change economically. But let me assure you, the fiscal conservatives were pretty much socially liberal. I mean, if their kids wanted abortion, and they got 4 trust funds lined up, and their daughter got pregnant by the gardener, let me assure you, that kid was not going to full term. Phone calls were made. discreetly. An abortion happened, not a coat hanger scrape. Professionally done, DNC at one of the best hospitals in New York City. Quiet, out of the way, done, silent. Okay? That's how the fiscal conservatives looked at social issues. All right? They weren't rabidly social conservatives against, they weren't racist at all. They didn't have to be. You had to be rich. You basically had to be white to be rich, so they didn't care. They weren't being threatened by minorities becoming rich. It didn't even, on those upper, east side of New York, these things didn't bother them. All right? Now, on the left, those Dixiecrats, they may have hated, and I'm not going to discount their hate of the Northern money. But what happened in the 1960s, they couldn't stomach. The liberals and the hippies came down through the South, all right, and totally upset them. Women took off their bras. That really, now they like tits as much as anybody if they're drinking beer and in a honky-tonk parlor, But the idea of men and men running things and women being subservient, especially after you had a few beers, it made more sense than before you started drinking that night. Okay? And then the politics. Anti-war. Anti-war. Peace, peace, peace. These are people who grew up with guns by their bed. And when that happened, the Dixiecrats in the South got real mad at the Democratic Party. Because the Democratic Party, change, accepted the change. They were the home of the anti-war movement. They were the home of the women's budding liberation movement, not the Republicans. Republicans only cared about money. Money, I know this stuff, but it's tax structure that we went. Capital gains taxes, XM Bank financing of our stuff overseas. This is stuff that matters to us. All this other crap is, But on the left, the Dixiecrats bolted. They couldn't stand being in the same party that the party had changed. This party that had been their party, quote unquote, for generations under generation, all of a sudden became somebody else's party. It was like they woke up, somebody repainted the house, all right? They painted it pink, all right? What the hell, all right? They looked in the backyard, there were women out there with no bras on. This is not the house they grew up in. And they bolted. Where do they bolt to? There's only two parties. You know what? Those Republicans, oh man, come to Daddy. Come to Daddy. We'll welcome you. We're both conservatives, I mean, we're both conservatives. This change is not good. All right, it's dangerous. It's un-American. It's threatening our core values. It's threatening everything. All right, and boy, did they come, and the balance of power went. Which way is right? My right. Boom. That's your left. The opposite. Okay, you're watching now. The balance of power went wham. All of a sudden, the Republicans were rolling after the 1960s. They had decored the base of the Democratic Party, brought them over into the Republican big tent, who welcomed the, quote, our brothers, our conservative brothers, with open arms and their votes. Now, they were only playing with them. All right? They were only playing. Come to Daddy. Come to Daddy. All right? And they played with them because how can the 1% rule? How can the 1/10 of 1% rule in a democratic country? It's real hard. But they got a lot of money and they put a lot of thought into it. And that's where it got to. In the 1960s, they was going to set a trend for the next 50 years. That's now over. But that's what happened. And the topic is politics. Why things are the way they are, how things are going to become what they're going to become, and why things were the way they were. In my previous program, I was talking about the left and the right, conservatives and liberals, and the huge change, the shift, the basic land shift that happened during the 1960s that upset the power between the left and the right that existed previously. That the social conservatives, who were basically the bulwark, the Southern Democrats, 1960s bolted the Democratic Party because the Democratic Party has traditionally been the party of change. And change in the 1960s meant women's rights, anti-war movement, and civil rights. And to the hard rock social conservatives of the Dixiecrats, the Southern 60s Democrats, this was too much. And this is a huge block. Now what happened with this was that the physical conservatives saw this was going on and they made happy face to the social conservatives. They said, listen, we're conservatives too. We don't like this kind of change. All right? The truth of the matter is the fiscal conservatives, the Republicans, only cared about fiscal conservatism, how to keep money in their hands. The top 1/10 of 1%, the top 1%, whatever it was. All right? And they worked long and hard at it. All right? The liberal, they wanted to split the pie. They wanted to make an equitable system more equitable. They wanted justice. They wanted fairness. And it wasn't going on. And so they were sitting there flopping around because they didn't have real power. It was only when a crisis would come along that they would sort of float up power and take them. And then when things reached a certain way, the rich would shove them back down again. All right? What happened during the 1960s is that when the Southern Dixiecrats, the social conservatives, bolted, Jesus, you know, this, remember that? The moral majority? Well, who was the moral majority? What drove these people? Well, basically, they were the Southern Baptists, the Southern Baptist Convention. This is before the evangelicals rolled up on the path. This is before all these little mega churches started happening. These were the Southern Baptists, all right? Now, who were the Southern Baptists and where did they come from? Well, I grew up a Baptist, all right? Little suburb, not a Southern Baptist. I was an American Baptist, ABC, American Baptist Convention. There was a Southern Baptist Convention, SBC, all right? And I did a little reading into it. Before the Civil War, there was only one, the American Baptist Convention. And their tenet was, if you are not baptized by full immersion in water to wash the sins away from you, you are not going to enter the kingdom of heaven. Simple. Simple. The tenet of faith, an act to validate that tenet, and you're in, like Flint. Or so they said. All right? And this worked for a whole lot of people until the Civil War came along. And the issues of the Civil War are so great that the Southern Baptist Convention appeared, quote, out of nowhere. Well, it wasn't nowhere. It was in the South. All right? Because these people believed also that unless you are fully immersed with the water and wash away your sins, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Well, why did they find it necessary to create the Southern Baptist Convention? One word, slavery. The American Baptist Convention was against slavery. And the Southerners were all for slavery. And so these fine Christians, now, far be it from me to say who goes through those portals. And I think you're lucky that I'm not the one choosing. And I'm lucky that you're not the one choosing either. All right? But far be it from me to say who goes in and who goes out. I'm just saying why these things happen. All right? So with slavery in their blood, when the hippies came along, when the 60s came along, when civil rights came along, these people bolted out of the Democratic Party, and the Republicans went, come to daddy. Come to daddy. And they went. Why do you think the Bank of America got put in North Carolina? From New York. Charlotte. Why do you think Texas became such an economic center of Wall Street money, energy? Not just because they had oil. Why do you think the Bushes moved? These are Connecticut people. Connecticut Yankees. They didn't give that talk and they wear Tony Lama boots and, you know, stroll around and you know, and talk that kind of shit and drank beer and beat the shit out of people who disagree with them. No, these are frat boys. How do you think the Bushes ended up in Texas? If you don't come to daddy, we're coming to you. All right? And what this did, this totally shifted the balance of America from some sort of thing like this into, boom, the right, here was the left, stuck up on that teeter-totter, their legs hanging out, and the fat Republicans with their foot on the ground going, come on, jump up and down, scream, scream. You can't get me up, can't get me up, can't look at that guy, look at those women, look at them hippies, look at them hippies on the other end of the thing. And the hippies jumped, and a war movement jumped. They couldn't dislodge the GOP, which now had this huge disaffected Southern bloc of social conservatives now calling themselves Republicans, which would have put their grandfathers into the grave for no reason at all. All right? But the lure of money and the chance to be included in the power structure was too great for them to turn down. All right? And so the GOP basically played with these folks. They weren't intending to give them real power. They weren't intending them to take away their Federal Reserve Bank, which was the source of their debt-based money. They weren't intending them to take real power in the Republican Party. They just intended to play with them and take their votes, which they did, which left the Democrats up on that teeter-totter, their legs sticking out, farther off the ground, with no power at all for a long, long time. All right? Now, Kennedy, because of his personal charisma, he came down and went like this. All right? And he really wanted to change the Federal Reserve. He and his brother. They knew where money, economic power was in the United States. They knew why it wasn't equal. They knew why New York was such a power base and sucking productivity from the rest of the country. And they were going to turn back the clock and give back the money-making powers that were vested in the U.S. Treasury back to the United States government. And in 1963 in the spring, John F. Kennedy empowered the U.S. Treasury to issue $20 million in silver-backed $20 bills, backed by silver in the U.S. Treasury. 6 months later, he was dead. The following year, Lyndon Baines Johnson sold off the $20 million of silver, making sure they would never do that again, and recalled all those $20 bills. All right? Bobby Kennedy decides to take off where his brother left off, and he was killed. Lone gunman. Lone gunman. You think Brutus was the only one who took power from Caesar? This happened whenever money and power was at stake. And it happened in the 1970s, 1960s in the United States. Martin Luther King, the Kennedys. I mean, these were not innocent people. I mean, they were innocent people, really, but they weren't just killed by accident, though the Bower boys made it look so. So what happened is, then you got Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter. Now this guy, he really cared about people. I mean, he goes out and builds houses and did all these nice things, and and things like that. But they basically made a fool of him. I mean, they made a joke out of Jimmy Carter. All right? And they made sure when Jimmy Carter, let me tell you something about Jimmy. All right? We all talk about what happened when inflation got out of control. All right? This is what happened. Paul Volcker, who was the Fed when Nixon was in there, he was Assistant Secretary of Treasury. All right? And it was the Republicans who cut gold out of the money system. They took it out in 1971. All right? They could have revalued gold, devalued the U.S. dollar, and we'd still have a gold-based system. All right? And not the problems that we have today. But because Milton Friedman thought free markets would determine, the value of money, we wouldn't have excessive negative trade balances, he was wrong on both counts. Told Nixon, cut them loose, and they did, and all of a sudden, everything went haywire. 9 years later, when inflation was running into double digits, Jimmy Carter was the one who brought Paul Volcker into the Fed. Now, Paul Volcker was the one who let gold out of the bag and caused the trouble before, and now we all think Paul Volcker was such a wonderful man because he put out the fire. He did put out the fire. But you forget, Paul Volcker was the one who lit it. Anyway, so be it. That's not the purpose of this talk. All right? So Volcker gets back in, and Jimmy Carter was the one who brought him in. But they basically made a laughingstock out of Jimmy Carter. When Reagan took power, after Jimmy Carter was just dismissed to the slag heap of history, the very day that he took power, the Iranians let the captives go. And you think this is coincidence? No. The Republicans set it up that way. Why? The Republicans, by this time, had consolidated power from Wall Street, the White House, and the military industrial complex. All right? William Casey, who was head of the SEC under President Ronald Reagan, had been head of the CIA. This started a whole tradition of CIA, Wall Street, New York, power blocks in the Republican Party. George Bush Sr. followed Reagan, head of the CIA, oil trader, the Bush family, and then his idiot son gets in. Not as smart as the dad, but they can count on him. All right? Doesn't matter. They don't care who gets pointed in. They just care how the deal gets cut. And the deal gets cut way before you go in that booth and you pull and you fight and you yell and scream. Now, there are real issues at stake in America. There are things worth being concerned about. All right? And I'm not telling you not to be concerned. I'm just saying that you should have a little more perspective on your effect on the system and why the system is the way it is. Like I say, you should read Nomi Prince's book that just came out in paperback, All the President's Bankers. It explains the role of money in both political parties. And I'm going to tell you something now, where the big shift happened. How the Democrats left high and dry the Republicans on the teeter-totter. This is not good. I mean, this is a teeter-totter where the Republicans are down here holding, you know, laughing at the Democrats with their legs sticking up. Ah, let me down, let me down, let me down. How the Democrats got back into power. How did they get back into power? When the Republicans had such an advantage since the 1960s with a social conservative base, giving them votes to concentrate wealth and power more and more on that side of the aisle. The way they did it was this. Bill Clinton got elected president. William Jefferson Clinton, an ambitious man. Isn't that what they said about Brutus? Well, Brutus killed Caesar to take office. All Clinton did was kill whatever power base that the Democrats had. He sold out the Democratic power to the bankers on Wall Street. Robin Rubin, Larry Summers, and Goldman Sachs came into the United States government, the Democratic Party, gratis of William Jefferson Clinton. 2 years after Clinton took office, they had a peso crisis in Mexico. Billions of dollars were immediately voted by the United States Senate, Congress, to indemnify, to help Mexico out. Well, the Mexican bonds had taken a beating. And when we mean beating, this has a different reason, purpose, or to you people like you and I and to Wall Street. Okay? What Wall Street does is they have leveraged bets. They take what money they have, they lever it out, you know, 10, 20, 30 times the amount. So in other words, if they have a $10 million cash bet, they've got $100 million exposure. Okay? And if the $100 million goes up, they make, let's say they make a 10% gain on $100 million. Well, that's a 100% gain on their actual capital because it's levered up. But by the same token, that leverage exposes them to a dangerous downside. If with the $10 million they place a $100 million bet, and that $100 million bet loses $10 million and down to $90 million, all of a sudden their $90 million, their $10 million is wiped out. Zero. They're down to zero. And the Mexican bonds lost more than 10%. Wall Street investors who were exposed to Mexican Treasury bonds were wiped out. But then the United States went to the aid of Mexico, and in that bill fully indemnified all bondholders of Mexican debt. Goldman Sachs. A check was written directly from the U.S. Treasury to Goldman Sachs. Bill Clinton, Robert Rubin, and Larry Summers. He let Voldemort into Hogwarts. He let the money into the Democratic Party, Wall Street. And you know what? The Democrats got powerful. Why? Because now Wall Street didn't care who was in office. They already owned the Republicans, all right? And now they own the Democrats. And if you own the opposition, you can get a lot more done than just owning your own little party. And Bill Clinton delivered in spades. During his first administration, he signed a media act that allowed Fox News to operate in the United States. Before Fox News, there was a caveat that it had to be fair and impartial. After Fox News, they had a ruling. It didn't have to be that way anymore. Bill Clinton signed it in. And in 1991, he delivered big time. There's a reason why Bill Clinton is filthy rich. There's a reason why Hillary Clinton is filthy rich. They were just lawyers trying to make their way in the world, all right? But Wall Street has remembered them because of what they did for them. They gave Wall Street the keys to the kingdom. The keys that the Republican Party could not give to Wall Street because they already owned the Republican Party. Only the opposition could give Wall Street what they really wanted. And what they really wanted, they got in 1999 when both houses signed a bill, the Graham-Leach-Biley Act, that repealed Glass-Steagall, an act passed in 1934 at the depths of the Great Depression. The only act passed by Congress to ensure that another depression would not happen again. And what it said was this, that henceforth commercial banks would not be able to allow the bet the same as America in the casino of Wall Street. And they split the banks in two. You had commercial banks, which took deposits, and you had investment banks, which had investors that bet on Wall Street. In 1999, Bill Clinton, both House, Senate, and erased that line. Erased that line. It's no wonder that within 10 years, they had a major, major collapse in 2008. It's sort of like wondering how you got AIDS. All right? I mean, you can be in denial about it. But when you decided to have unsafe sex at a swingers party down the street, when you already knew what was going on, you got to take responsibility. All right? But what has happened is Americans are so dissociated from the political process, they have no idea what's going on because they don't want you to know what's going on. The reason why your media doesn't tell you what's going on, they're owned by the vested interests. They're owned by them. And this is with both parties. Now what happened was this. Bill Clinton comes in, sells out to the moneyed interests, to Wall Street. Republicans come back into power, steal the 2000 elections, all right, with their little voting booths, and the Democrats didn't stand up. All they needed was one. In the House, all the black congressmen stood up and challenged the vote. Okay? They wanted it to be looked at again. All they needed was one senator. And here was Gore running on the ticket. All right? And he wouldn't even stand up. There were no black senators. The blacks were so disenfranchised, they didn't give a damn. They were going to stand up and say this is wrong. But all the white Democrats, they're all bought off. There's a reason why they didn't stand up, because they were bought off. If you really want to see what American politics is now, I suggest that you Google Catherine Austin Fitts, all right, and read her little story on private prisons and Dillon Reed and stuff like that. But she was the Assistant Secretary of HUD underneath the first President Bush. She was a Republican. She was also a managing director of Dillon Reed, a white boys firm on Wall Street in 1980. She was a member of the establishment, and she saw how it's run. And they drove her. They got real mad. Catherine Austin Fitts turned down an appointment to the Fed. She turned down, far more dangerously, an appointment to the Council on Foreign Relations. All right? And she was warned. They said, you know, Catherine, if you do that, that's it for you. And she turned it down. And in many ways, it didn't help her with what was going to happen later. But this is what is going on in America. Wall Street owns both parties. You can vote this way, you can vote that way. Do it. Do it. All right? I don't really care, because something else is going on that's even bigger. What happened is the chaos, the thing that shifted balance of power from a, sort of a stasis, an equal point, heavily in favor of the Republicans, with the disaffection of these social conservatives to the Republican Party, balanced out by Bill Clinton selling out the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, to the Wall Street interests and Goldman Sachs, has been now supplanted by what's going on in the Republican Party. The fight between the social conservatives and the fiscal conservatives. After 40 years, the social conservatives got sort of mad. All right? I mean, screaming and yelling, and they got their votes in there, and they had people in the Congress, and, you know, they had media attention, and they had Bank of America in Charlotte, North Carolina. They had Republican money in the South. They were driving around Mercedes instead of pickup trucks. All right? They were happy, except they never could get what they wanted. As soon as they got close to really getting an abortion, something happened. As soon as they got close to religious bigotry being made legitimate, something happened. As soon as they got states' rights going, something happened. All right? So they got mad at the Republicans. They realized there were elements of the Republican Party which they now identified with, stopping them from getting what they had. So in 2012, they went for it. They went for it and scared the bejesus out of the money boys. And you know what happened? The money boys noticed. And now what's going on in the Republican Party, whenever those social conservatives get even close, that hammer comes down. The money gets pulled. The corporations go like this. So all those people used to invoke the name of Jesus Christ, you're up shit creek. Before, you used to get all the media attention you wanted. Now you're getting a whole lot of flack. Indiana, Arkansas, whenever those social conservatives stick up their head, it's like political whack-a-mole. Boom! The money boys are going to make sure you can vote for us, but that doesn't give you the right to tell us what to do. We own you. Come to daddy. Or you can go back to the Democrats. Democrats, man. No, they're not going to. So you have a complete disaffection in the American political party. You know what's going to happen? Both the left is disaffected. Both the right is disaffected. All right? I mean, the Republicans got so bad that they bolted, not the social conservatives, but the sort of, some of the money conservatives, bolted the Republican Party because of what Bush did. They voted for a black man. My God, that's huge. And then the black man did exactly what the white bankers told him to do. So they left. I don't blame them. All right? And now you're left with the two crappy alternatives. Clinton and Bush. Bush and Clinton. And you know what? At a certain point, the American people are going to become so disaffected, they're going to throw them both out. There's going to be a revolution, the likes of which haven't happened since 1776. And the halls of Congress are going to be gutted. And this nation will wake up and take back what has been taken away from it by all the president's bankers and all the bankers' minions. A better day is coming. I watched this thing for a long time. I'm 70 years old now. You know, I never voted in a presidential election. I majored in political science. It's happening.